my father, he wasn't a talker. I said, Aunt Vivian, help me. Where did this name Miller come from? Like, Miller. Who's Miller? When I asked her that question, she got this really strange look on her face. And she said, well, baby, there are some stories that you just don't tell.
On June 24th, 1890, after years of suffering from what was only recorded as a painful, insidious disease, Centre College president Ormond Beatty passed away in his sleep. Ormond Beatty was known throughout his life as a generous and charitable man, donating so much of his wealth to Centre College and even supporting individual students who could not afford the steep tuition. Throughout his 60-year career, 18 of which spent as the Centre College president, he never lost his passion for teaching. It was said that the students were better men on account of his wise instruction and friendly counsel. Having downplayed the seriousness of his condition, never giving up teaching or his post as elder in the Second Presbyterian Church, his death was a shock to the community of Danville, Kentucky. The community, which would then step forward to create what was said to be the largest funeral procession the town cemetery had ever seen. Beatty's headstone stands tall and prominent amongst the rows of neat graves, displaying his surname in bold letters at the top, followed by his full name, his birth and death dates, as well as those of his second wife, Mildred Ann Bell. 53 years later, on October 7th, 1943, another Danville native by the name of Edward S. Miller passed away from pneumonia. But he didn't die in Danville. No, Edward Miller died in a small town nearly 400 miles away, just outside Chicago, Illinois. Miller was a medical doctor, a war veteran, a socialite, and a Mason. Though his life was full of impressive stories that deserve, nearly demand, to be told, there is hardly any information about him online. No Wikipedia page on his accomplishments, no details of a lavish funeral, no extensive family tree on Ancestry.com. All we know of him is what we can piece together from a few books and newspapers archived online, as well as the stories from descendants old enough to have met him. Oh yeah, and an unmarked grave. What exactly is the connection between these two men? One, a great educator, born, raised, and buried in Danville, Kentucky, and the other a great physician, born and raised in Danville, but who spent his adult years in Chicago, Illinois. What is the connection to be drawn between them, and why should the focus be put on their graves? Why did one man have his name gilded in history and the other erased? The answer is complicated, but it comes down to the two things so many American history books seem to favor most: race and money. You see, a very plain and simple, blink and you'll miss it fact, addressed in one line on his Wikipedia page, is that Ormond Beatty was a slaver. Edward S. Miller, on the other hand, was born enslaved. What is this podcast for?
Well, it's we're calling it Finding Papa, and it is a podcast surrounding the making of the documentary Finding Papa. So,
have you ever made a documentary before?
Never. I felt compelled to tell the story in documentary fashion. I got on the web because, I think I'm a smart guy. I can figure this out, right?
You are.
I said, well, I need to take a class. And so I Googled college in Chicago called Columbia College, which is an arts college. My awesome nephew graduated from there, and I was like, oh, okay. I was like, oh, I'll take a class. And I was like, documentary filmmaking basics. Did that say $7,000? Nope. And so then I was like, oh, Udemy, making documentary, $14.95. Now that price is right. So I'm in the process of taking that class as we speak.
Is it helping?
Well, when I signed up for it, I thought it was going to be automatically like,
Grab your camera and go.
we guarantee you will have a documentary made today. Yeah. But it didn't, unfortunately, it didn't really work like that.
No.
And so in the meantime,
What are you learning about?
I'm just learning about the process, and it really is much more, you have to have, just like any good story, you have to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And you have to map out the sequences and how it's done. It's not just like,
and the beats.
Timeline, and it's not just getting out there and like, boom, here's a documentary.
No.
So it's just,
So what made you want to tell this story?
when I was young, I lived next door to the Turners. They were my next door neighbors. They had a grandfather that lived with them. His name was Mr. Butts. He had a real gravelly voice.
No. Stop.
Yes. Mr. Butts had a gravelly voice. Yes.
Wow.
Yes. Mr.
How was it spelled? With a Z?
No, Butts. But Mr.
Stop!
Butts,
Stop! You're kidding me. I'm sorry. I know that I'm taking us off course, but I jokingly put Butts as my last name in video games. It'll be like Jorah Butts, and
I thought it was super cool that Craig Turner had a grandfather. Like, I didn't have a grandfather. My mom was, well, obviously I had grandfathers, but none living, right?
Yeah.
My grandmother was a single mother, and her father was a dude that was not such a good guy. And I've heard some stories about him not being a good guy. And then I would learn about my grandfather on my father's side. And his name was Edward Miller, and I thought that was super cool because my dad was Edward Miller, and my brother was Edward Miller. So all these Edward Millers in the family. So I thought that was...
Oh, you got passed over. You were born a little too late.
Yeah, there was a show that came on before you were born called Perry Mason, and it had a prosecutor on it, or not, a private detective. His name was Paul, and that's where I got my name from. So
wait, no, you literally were named after a character from Perry Mason?
Yes, my sister named me.
You never know.
So I thought it was super cool that Craig had a grandfather, and I started asking my dad about his father. And my father wasn't a big talker. He was an amazing father. I mean, oh my God, he was just like the quintessential Black father, supportive, hardworking, did well. He was a science teacher at the Board of Education for many years.
But he wasn't much of a talker.
Not a big talker, and especially about his background. But he would tell me a little bit of things, and I did learn the reason that I didn't know my grandfather is that he was born in 1858 in Kentucky, and my dad was born in 1920, which made my grandfather 62 when my dad was born. And that exploded my brain, like, what? But then I also had learned through my aunt and my dad that he was a medical doctor. So these were just words to a 18-year-old or 15-year-old or 24-year-old. Then I got into the business of raising my own family, but it wasn't till recently when I started to do some of these ancestry searches. I started trying to find out more and more about this dude, Edward Miller, because he just haunted me.
What made you start looking into that?
This Harvard grad, Henry Louis Gates, he's a brilliant guy, was doing this program that was about finding kind of your roots, right? And I would watch it on PBS. It was really interesting. I was like, well, let me try to see what I can find out about my family. The story that kept jumping off the page at me was this dude, Edward Miller. And so the more I searched on him, the more content it is, because that's one of the things that when you're African American, you just don't have that much content. We don't have that kind of history. Like every time I would read it was like, oh, Edward Miller did this and Edward Miller did that. So one of the things I found out was that I lived in the south suburbs of Chicago, hence my Chicago Bulls hat, for the last 30 years. And when I started doing my research on Edward Miller, I had an article in one of the documents like, oh, Dr. E.S. Miller co-founded this cemetery. And it was like called Mount Glenwood Memorial Gardens Cemetery. And there are some really super famous people that are buried at this cemetery. And when I opened up the history of it, it said Mount Glenwood Cemetery was founded by Dr. E.S. Miller in 1908. I've lived in the south suburbs for 30 years, and this cemetery was literally 15 minutes from my house, right?
That's close.
My grandfather died in 1943. And I learned from my aunt that my grandfather was buried.
But with this being called Finding Papa, is Papa what your dad called him?
Yes, my dad called him Papa. My grandmother called him Dr. Miller, but that's a whole nother story.
We will end up getting into your grandmother.
We will get into my grandmother.
But how old was your grandmother, real quick? Your grandfather was, Papa was 62.
62.
And B.
My grandmother, I believe, B. B was, I believe, 29.
Okay.
So there was a little bit of an age difference between them.
Just a little bit. Just a little bit. It's funny. I went weeks planning this podcast with my father, thinking nearly the whole time that Papa was what he called his grandfather, as a grandchild. Why I was under that misconception, I have no idea. Maybe because I always called my father Dad or Daddy, and Papa just seems more like a grandparent name to me. I am now well aware of the timeline and that the math ain't mathin' on my father calling Edward S. Miller anything at all. Living from 1858 to 1943, Papa missed the birth of all of his grandchildren, my dad in particular by a good 16 years. One of the many downsides of having children in your 60s. I know it must be sad for my father, not having gotten to experience the love of a grandparent in his childhood or reap the rewards of their counsel as an adult. Whenever I think of my grandparents who have passed, Pop, grandmother, and my mom's father, Granddaddy, I feel a tinge of guilt that I didn't make the most of my time with them. As a kid, I didn't understand the true depths of the pain I would feel with them gone, but I am grateful for the time I did have, and I'm thankful that their stories live on in my mother and father, and in my aunts and uncles and cousins. Sadly, this is not the case for my paternal great-grandfather. He died nearly 80 years ago, and anyone who knew him has assumedly passed on. So here we are, blowing dust off archives, trying to breathe new life into the story of Edward S. Miller, hoping it won't be lost to the annals of time like a tombstone to the wet earth, or worse, erased, like a black name in a white household on an 1850 U.S. Census.
When my grandmother, B, the one that was 30 years younger, passed away in about 1985 or something, my aunt said, Eddie, who was my dad, who was also Edward, we should bury Mama next to Papa. And my dad goes, nope. B landed on tough times and she sold those plots. And my Aunt Vivian was like, no, Eddie, you're wrong. They're plots. Let's go to the Mount Glenwood. And Dad, who was the older brother, said, no, Vivian, I know she sold them. Let's not waste our time. So she was buried somewhere else.
Typical.
So fast forward ahead to 2000, right before the pandemic. I was like, well, this is going to be boss, because I'm going to go to Mount Glenwood and I'm going to see this giant
monument
monument to our founder. Oh, thank you so much, Dr. E.S. Miller. I go to Mount Glenwood and I go in and I said, oh, I would love to see this where my grandfather, Edward S. Miller, who, by the way, was one of the founders of this cemetery. I want to see the giant monument, right?
This plaque at the entrance.
Yeah, and this is a cemetery that Elijah Muhammad was buried in, the famous cyclist Major Taylor, all these famous Chicagoans, Duke Slater, a lot of these famous black Chicagoans were buried in this cemetery. And my grandfather was, instrumental in this thing happening. And I was like, oh, yeah, I'm going to go see. I can't wait. So she says, okay, your grandfather's plot is, I don't know, it's on a grid system. So let's say it's M22. You come around here and you come to the end of here and he's right down this row. And I was like, awesome. So I get in my car and I drove back and I get out the car and I park it. I start walking over and I was like, okay, M19, M20, 21, M22. Nothing here. I look up again, look down, look up, look down. I go back and look at the row number again. And then I go to the front. One of the workers was walking around. And I said, sir, they said my grandfather was M22 and circled it. And he said, oh, hold on. So he walked it off. He says, oh, yeah, no, this is M22. I said, well, there's no headstone. He said, well, sometimes people were buried without headstones. I said, oh, not my grandfather. He founded the cemetery. There would be a ginormous headstone in his honor. He said, now, one thing that happens, though, is sometimes the earth envelops. They eat these headstones, especially those who've been there for a while. So
just
maybe he had one of those. Sinks down and you can't find it. So there is a service that we will do, is we will do a sonogram to see if there's something below it. And we'll call you in a week and let you know whether we found something. I was like, okay, well, thank you so much. And, I left there, sure they were going to find something. Call me back. Nope. So we can't find anything under there. He was buried without a headstone.
Mount Glenwood Cemetery was opened in 1902 and was one of the first integrated cemeteries in the Chicago area. Originally, black families wishing to bury a loved one in a cemetery would have to do so under a false name. In 1908, 6 men met to discuss the inequalities of the funereal industry and the inaccessibility of honor in death for black Chicagoans. Those men included Jackson Gordon, J.L. Parks, R.M. Leach, L.W. Dickerson, and one Dr. E.S. Miller, which we know is short for Edward Smith Miller, my grandfather. Leading this change was a man identified on the cemetery's website simply as Mr. Patton. While it is actually strangely hard to find any information about Mr. Patton online, I believe he must have been the original owner of the cemetery, most likely a white man. An article from the October 29, 1910 copy of the Chicago Defender explains the unrest and heavy-heartedness of a washerwoman telling how she had to pay $50 for a grave and white people $25 stirred his very being. Mr. Patton decided to give them a chance, the same as any other citizen. As my father noted, these men worked together to turn the previously racially accepting Mount Glenwood into Mount Glenwood Memorial Garden, a haven for black mourners to not just lay their loved ones to rest, but to be able to visit them without fear of prejudice. Another Chicago Defender article describes the impact of the cemetery on a post-Reconstruction Chicago, but also pays a special note to its idyllic setting. The cemetery is a beautiful sight to behold. It is locked in, as it were, by the forest. At intervals, a train on the Chicago and Eastern Illinois Railway passes, making its appearance and disappearing as if on a stage. As of recording, I've yet to visit Mount Glenwood Memorial Gardens for myself, but I'm thankful to be living in the digital age where we can take virtual tours of Mars from our gaming chairs. So I figured I ought to just take a look at what I could see of Mount Glenwood online. It only took a few minutes of searching to realize, however, my efforts would be fruitless. It's not as if the plots are named and numbered on Google Maps. Besides, what would I be looking for, or at for that matter? A patch of grass? After all, there's no tombstone to look out for.
So like any good superhero movie, they all have origin stories. I think in order to begin to tell the story of Dr. Edward S. Miller, Papa, You need to know about his early life and the people that made him, and quite honestly, the people who allowed me to exist. So I'm going to start off by telling you the story of what we've learned so far. So we'll start with me. I'm Paul Odin Miller. Yes, Odin after the Norse deity Odin. I didn't like the name when my mom named me years ago, but it's pretty cool now. And I work as a 5G solution specialist for a large test and measurement company. I'm married to the love of my life for the last 40 years, Jean Thompson Miller, who was formerly a licensed attorney and is now a high school English department chair. We have 3 children: Jillian, who's in graduate school, Jeremy, who is an attorney, and finally Jordan, who works as a freelance writer and is also co-producing this documentary. And by the way, you've seen her already, listed as Jorah Miller. I was born in 1959 in Chicago, Illinois. I'm the son of Edward Sanford Miller, another Edward Miller. So for the purpose of this documentary, when we refer to my father, I'm going to call him Eddie. Eddie was born in 1920 and worked as a former science administrator with the Chicago Board of Education, and he passed back in 2004. My mother, who worked for 30 years as an elementary school teacher with the same Chicago Public Board of Education, passed in 2006. The lovely Ida Austin Miller. This union produced 4 children: Dawn Miller Scarlett, who's an attorney and formerly a Chicago Public School principal; Edward Worthington Miller, who we'll call Pete, who was a former charter smart school entrepreneur and presently a life coach; and finally Gerald Smith Miller, who's a video editor, web designer, and the main videographer on this project. So let's get back to Papa. My grandfather, Edward Smith Miller, was born enslaved in Girard County, Kentucky in 1858. In 1919, he married his second wife, who was my biological grandmother, Vivian Worthington Miller, who was born in 1893 in Defiance, Ohio. This union produced 2 children: my father, the previously discussed Eddie Miller, and my beautiful Aunt Vivian, who was a 40-year math and science teacher with the Chicago Board of Education, who passed not long ago in 2017. I'll start by saying what we're trying to do. Right?
Okay.
So, as the matriarch of our family, right?
Yeah, I am that.
Yes, you are.
I'm 91.
91 years, beautiful years old, and beautiful. We believe that there is an amazing story that is there, in particular about our grandfather.
Yeah, I wish I knew more about, that period of his life, but he just didn't talk about it. And the only thing I do know is that when we went to Danville, Obie and I, to try to look up some of that stuff, we talked to a lady who was quite an elderly lady who lived next door to my grandmother. Her name was Susan Penman, and she had brothers, a lot of brothers. So we were going to go to the state and look in the archives at the state, but we didn't make it, the state capitol. We didn't get there. We were driving, and I don't know, for whatever reason we had to get back. But it had to be, and so I don't know whether he was born in slavery or whether they were free. I just don't know. That was the kind of thing that Obie and I were going to explore, and then we just, you run out of steam with that kind of stuff. So you guys can look further into that and try to see.
Dr. Edward S. Miller was the son of Susan Penman, later known as Susan Davis after she married my great-grandfather, Samuel Davis, in Danville, Kentucky in 1868, when black marriages were finally recognized. Susan Pittman birthed 4 children, 3 of which were with an unknown father with the last name Miller. The children were Papa, a.k.a. Dr. Edward S. Miller, born in 1858, his brother John Miller, born in 1860, and his sister Fannie Miller Williams, who was born in 1865. So as we discuss our documentary as an origin story, it goes directly back to this unknown father of Edward, John, and Fannie Miller that had the surname Miller. While researching, I was fortunate to learn that I was not alone in this search. I researched my project along with my first cousin, Dr. Vivian Lewis, who was writing a medical journal article about the hardships of black physicians in the early 20th century. We later learned that we had a common cousin who was a renowned historian named Martha Jones of Johns Hopkins University. Martha had recently written the book Vanguard. Amazingly, we discovered that Martha's 2 times great-grandmother was also Susan Pittman. Through this, we learned that Susan Pittman's mother was a woman named Nancy Bell Pittman, who along with Barry Pittman had several children, one of which was our grandmother, Susan Pittman. Martha had learned that Nancy Bell Pittman and her parents were enslaved through the family of Ormond Beatty of Danville, Kentucky. But after continued research, we found that our family's extended enslaved lineage likely had its origins before Nancy Bell Pittman at a famous Louisville plantation called Oxmoor Farms. Located 8 miles outside of Louisville, Oxmoor Farms is a 250-year-old hemp plantation that over the years was the home of more than 100 enslaved people. It belonged to 5 generations of the Bullitt family. This was a family that likely enslaved many of my forefathers. We were provided 2 names that might help us learn more. Shirley Harmon, curator of Oxmoor Farms, and historian Dan Gettleman, executive director of the Reckoning Project, a 501c nonprofit organization whose mission is to examine the legacy of slavery and resulting race relations in America. He's also a subject matter expert in the impact of slavery in Kentucky. They were kind enough to agree to meet with me to discuss some of my questions about the origin of my great-grandfather and the life that my grandfather, Edward S. Miller, lived. So my superhero story was going to begin at Oxmoor Farms, and it seemed like that was a good place to start.
All right. Are you close?
Yeah, we're on.
Oh, you're on. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So I'm going to start us off, and first of all, I want to thank you guys for the time out of your really busy schedules at a really hectic time. I mean, it's Christmas time, so thank you so much for coming and sitting down with us. I talked to you guys about my project. Our project is called Finding Papa, and it's the story of a native Kentuckian, right, who was born in Girard County, who came to Danville, Kentucky as he was born in 1858, and we believe he was born enslaved, and he ended up having this amazing life where he became a barber, then moved to Meadville, and then came to Chicago in 1880, graduated from Chicago Homeopathic Medical College, left there, went to graduate school at the Harvey Medical College. He then became an officer in the iconic Illinois 8th Volunteer Infantry, which was the first infantry that allowed blacks to be an officer, of which he was one of. He later goes through and works along at this iconic hospital in Chicago's Brownsville neighborhood called Providence Hospital. where he works alongside a famous doctor named Daniel Hale Williams, who was the first doctor in America, I believe, that did open heart surgery. He then became a business tycoon, and he was with the Colored Knights of Pythias, and he was a board member in the first black bank in Chicago, a board member in the first black life insurance company in Chicago. And finally, he founded a cemetery called Mount Glenwood Memorial Gardens, where we have found that he's buried in the cemetery that he founded in 1906, and he's buried without a marker, which is tragic. We know the reason, we suspect the reason why that happened. It had a lot to do with bank failures and the Great Depression, and he died in 1943, basically penniless in Chicago. So, part of this project that we're working on, and what brings me here, is that we're trying to find out that Miller name. We cannot find out where my grandfather got the name Miller from. And so as I started doing history, it kind of led me through some association with a cousin of mine, who is also a historian by the name of Martha Jones, and she told me about Oxmoor. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to come down and meet with you guys to see if you guys can maybe help us in this mystery, like who this Miller is.
Mr. First?
Sure. I'm Shirley Harmon, a native Louisvillian, went to Xavier University, got a history degree there in Cincinnati, came back to Louisville, got a master's in history at the University of Louisville. And as soon as I finished my thesis there, my first job right out of grad school was working at the Filson Historical Society, which is a local historical society here in Louisville. And I was tasked with cataloging the Bullitt family papers. And so this was a massive collection that the Historical Society had just gotten a few years prior to that. And little did I know how massive it was until I started working on it. It took me about 4.5 years. It's 185 cubic feet of documents that detail life at Oxmoor Farm, which is a farm that is where we're sitting today. It's a farm that was in the Bullitt family from the 1780s until 1991. And over the course of the last 11 years, as we have transitioned from a lived-in home to what we're becoming in this field of historic homes, we started diving a little bit more deeper into some of the structures here. We have 4 former slave dwellings that are still on site. And as we begin diving into doing some renovating of those, it just happened that my paths crossed with Mr. Getteman, who's
So I'm Dan Getteman. I am the executive director of a nonprofit organization called Reckoning Inc. And our sort of origin story actually really does intersect very much with the place we're sitting today, which is Oxmoor Farm. I'm a documentary radio producer, so that's my background. And I set out to do a documentary series called The Reckoning that was focused on sort of the untold stories pertaining to slavery and race in Kentucky. And I wanted to know why. Mm-hmm. I found out that there were 250,000 people that were enslaved in Kentucky at the start of the Civil War. And that's a lot of people to sweep under the rug and not talk about. Kentucky was also a major exporter of slaves in the interstate slave trade. So there are so many people who were enslaved in Kentucky but ended up being, quote, sold down the river down to one of the slave markets in either Natchez, Mississippi or New Orleans. So there's this huge diaspora of formerly enslaved, of people who descend from folks who were enslaved in Kentucky. And the first thing that caught my attention was, what's a slave trader? What is going on here? I don't understand. It never had crossed my mind that that was an occupation. And so the first thing I did was I opened up Google and I put in slave trader, Kentucky. And the first hit was an article in the New York Times about a man named Stephen Chenoweth. And so I tried to figure out who that man was, and his son married into the Bullitt family.
The time we have.
Yes.
So I am curious in terms of, with you understanding what my project
Yes,
is.
yes, yes.
Yeah, okay.
So all of this, all the historical records, the rich historical records that are available in Kentucky that help to illuminate African American history here, and specifically the genealogy of individual families, allow us to make connections for people like you to your ancestors, okay? So in particular, the ancestors of the family that lived in this house, and when I say ancestors, I'm talking like parents and grandparents, okay? The woman who was the mistress of this house was a woman named Mildred Fry Bullitt. So her father's name was Joshua Fry, Jr., I think. Isn't that right?
There's a John. His grandfather was Joshua, so he's
Okay, he's the second.
yeah.
He's the second Joshua Fry. And I am quite certain that your ancestors were enslaved by him. Okay, the Joshua Fry, who was the father of the woman who lived in this house.
Yes.
But here's the point. I did a quick check. There was a prominent Virginia-born enslaver family named Miller, and a couple of their sons moved to Kentucky. And so I just found a guy named Buckner Miller. So Buckner's another old Kentucky, old Virginia enslaver name, Buckner Miller, who lived in Mercer County and was an enslaver. And he had a brother who moved to Jefferson County and was an enslaver near this place we are right now.
Okay.
Probably a few plantations over.
Okay.
I think it's highly probable that one of your ancestors was enslaved by this Miller family that could very well have married into the Fry family. So I could do a little homework on this, and maybe the next time we talk,
Okay.
I might be able to have some more information on this. I may not be able to know for positive certain, but it is, I just want to reinforce this fact that by following the women's families, we can oftentimes find where these people came from. Okay.
So why would Susan Penman always go by Susan Penman, then she marries later and goes by Susan Davis, but all her children be named Miller? Is that
Okay, I got an answer for you.
okay?
So, and I'm going to go back to my knowledge of Civil War soldiers, okay? So, I'm not saying this happened, but it could have happened, and again, I'll be happy to help you find this out. One is almost half of the eligible men who could have joined the Union Army, black men, joined the Union Army. So that's the highest proportion of black men in any state of the Union that joined the Union Army. So that means that roughly, I'm going to guess, roughly half of the black families in Kentucky had at least one member of that family that joined the Army. So what that means is all of those families were eligible for a military pension. And so families sometimes would take the name that was an enslaver name that was given to the soldier, okay? So it was very important in Kentucky in particular that enslavers' property was protected, enslavers' needs were protected. And if an enslaver, if several of his enslaved men joined the Union Army and his name was Miller, the government would call all of those men Miller. So that in the same way that they like put your name in your uniform or something, so they, or dog tags, you wear dog tags so they know who you are. Well, this way they would always know you belong to the Millers. The children are still eligible for a military pension. She isn't, because she's, especially if she remarries. So she might have a new last name.
Fascinating.
And you might not know this if you're just looking at what the census says. So sometimes these pensions were the difference between a family eating and not eating.
Okay.
Paying rent and not paying rent.
Okay, so this is an extraordinary afternoon. I was telling Shirley before you came, Dan, that this is a very emotional experience for me. When my brother and I drove up to the gates, it became real. that my family was enslaved here, and they might not have been my direct family, but cousins, and it was kind of haunting. And I spent so much time studying my grandfather, and I know that story so well. To really hear a broader story is extraordinary, and I just want to thank you for the time out of your schedule to start this. And like I said, we'll be back. So
Okay.
okay. Stop is here in Danville, Kentucky. This is the origin story as we do this documentary, Finding Papa. But we know for a fact that this, the beginning of the story, we had his mother, Susan Penman, who later married a gentleman by the name of Samuel Davis back in 1868 when marriages with African Americans were legitimized. And in her work, she was an amazing, amazing woman in her own rights. She mothered 3 children. One of the children was my grandfather, Edward S. Miller. His brother was John Miller, who became this outstanding caterer in Cincinnati. And his sister was Fannie Miller, who just had an extraordinary life in academia and had children, which fantastic backgrounds. But it was really fun to come down here, and as our first stop, we wanted to come to this cemetery. We wanted to find her headstone and that of her husband, their husband, Samuel Davis. And then after that, we wanted to just kind of get a feeling for what this whole experience was like. But what's super exciting was that at this cemetery, there is a plaque. And this plaque, as you can see, says, "In memory of our founder, Mrs. Susan Davis, and the members of the Domestic Economy Club." Now, we're not sure what that year this was put up. We believe it was around 1910. It was centered on her work as working in the cemetery to beautify it. Now, this is an African American cemetery. I think at some point went into a certain level of disrepair, and I think Susan Davis and the Domestic Economy Club really worked hard in making this this really sacred place the place that it should have been. So this plaque was exciting. I'd heard about this plaque. I read that it existed, and so yes. So now I'm going to go through the process of trying to find her headstone. All right, so we are on our way. A lot of these graves are from the older graves. Looks like that one's 1906, born in 1825. As I said earlier, the cemetery I think was founded in 1867, so these are a lot of amazing people who were buried here. Some of the people I understand are buried in this graveyard without a marker, which is often sad. Let me see what this one says. No, okay. And so, let me see, William Tompkins. Wow, not too, let me see what this, you might think if with the Domestic Club she would have a, this is Sophie Campbell. No. Oh. Here we go. Here we go. Samuel Davis and his wife, Susan Davis. So it looks like this is the marker for my great-grandmother, Susan Davis. And this is going to be really hard to see, but that's S-U-S-A-N Davis, D-A-V-I-S, and her husband, Samuel Davis. And yes, and you can see Davis down on the bottom. So I'm going to sit and take a quick prayer for the souls of my ancestors. I thank God for them. But not for them, I would not be here. So, all right. Extraordinary. Oh, wow. This is her daughter, Lillian B. Welch. This is Susan's daughter with Davis. Awesome. That's an amazing find. Okay.
Nancy Graves.
Oh, yeah.
Edmund Graves.
Yeah. And then, wow. Okay. Here we go. Wow. This amazing plaque right next to my great-grandmother is my great-great-grandmother, Nancy Graves, and her husband, Edmund Graves. Wow. I love it. What a marker that is. I love it. Yeah, so my people right around here, Edmund Graves, Nancy Graves, and we'll learn more about her as we go through. Beautiful, beautiful marker honoring her. Wow, we're honoring them. My great-great-grandmother and my great-great-grandfather. Wow. Wow. Okay. I just can't get over that. This is a thing.